CentralOps.net and sites like it are a wonderful resource for the hacker, as it helps to provide some anonymity during our assessments. CentralOps allows us to create a domain dossier or email dossier on our victims, gathering openly available information such as the owner of the domain names, the technical contacts, technical details, and the network ranges involved. This is key information that's required for us to gather as we attempt to understand the victim network and plan our attacks. We can use CentralOps from any computer with a web browser, and since we already have our Kali machine connected to the internet, that's what we're going to use. So from our Kali machine, we're going to open up Firefox. From here, we're going to go to CentralOps.net. So once we get to CentralOps.net, we're going to go to the domain dossier. So now we need to pick a domain to look up or an IP address. For our example, I'm going to use AVG. So AVG is an antivirus company located in the Netherlands. So we're going to look them up, and we're going to choose all 5 options. We want the traceroute, the service scan, the DNS records, the whois of both network and domain. And then hit go. So the first thing we're going to see is our address lookup. And this is just going to do a basic check of the name to the IP address. In this case, AVG will resolve to 2 different IP addresses as displayed here on the screen. After that, we're going to see the domain whois record. Now with a large company like AVG or a Yahoo or a Google or somebody like that, you're not going to get as much detailed information as you would if you had a small business. So in this case, we can look at who they registered their domain through, which in this case was Mark Monitor Incorporated. So we can see that, and that might play into a spear phishing campaign, but it's probably not real helpful for us right now. We're going to go ahead and scroll down even further. The next thing we're going to come to is the detailed whois record. And in here we're going to see the registration information. We're going to see who the person is registered to. In our case, since it's a large company, they just put in domain administrator. If it's a small business, you usually see the owner of the business's name or their technical support people. You also will get information such as where they are. In this case, they are located in Amsterdam with the street name listed there. You also get phone numbers. This can be useful as part of a pre-texting campaign as well. And you'll get an email address. In the case of a large company like this, they probably are not monitoring this address, but it's domainadministration@avg.com. If we had somebody's username in there, for instance, jason.dion@avg.com, that could tell us the naming structure for email addresses that could be useful in a spear phishing campaign, or a good point of contact to use as part of a spear phishing campaign, such as the technical registration point of contact. If we had that information, we can use that as a way into the network. We're going to continue scrolling down, see what else we can find. Again, domain administrator, not the most helpful thing because again, this is a large company. One of the things I noticed that's kind of interesting is their name servers. If you notice, they're using acame.net. Acame is actually a large network service provider. They actually can help prevent denial of service attacks from occurring. So if that was going to be our strategy to take down this network, it may not work as well. If they're a small business, they're probably not using Acame, and that may be a way that you can take down their network. But again, a denial of service is never used in ethical hacking. There's really no reason for it. But it's something we can consider using our research here. We're going to go down to the network record. Now the network whois is a little bit different. You'll notice here it actually gives us a range, 93.184.217.0 up through 0.31 is actually being owned and operated by AVG. That means they have 31 IP addresses, 30 of which are routable on the internet. That is 30 possible targets, whether they're routers, firewalls, or actual servers tied to the internet, that we could be looking at, if that is within the scope of our assessment. As we go down a little bit further, you can notice who actually registered for these IP addresses. Derek Sawyer. So again, that can be a name that we can use as part of a pre-texting campaign. It might be a name that we use as part of an email phishing campaign. Lots of different uses when we find good names and good email addresses for people. We're going to go down into our DNS records next. So in our DNS records, you'll see the DNS records for avg.com. There's 2 address records as we saw earlier. We see 93.184.217.9 and then we see 93.184.211.28. These are 2 different servers that are answering up for the name avg.com. This is probably being done because AVG is such a large company. One server couldn't handle the load, so they have 2 servers that are acting as content switches to provide that service to their customers. And then again, we see acame.net as the name servers answering up. So again, it's going to be load sharing and helping to handle a large amount of load that would come against those servers. Next, we're going to look at traceroute. So it starts out from the servers at CentralOps and goes out across the internet until it finds where it's going. In this case, once we get to the stars in line 10 through 13, that's usually where it hits firewalls, and some companies will not respond to pings or trace routes, and the reason why is they don't want you mapping their network. So we know they have at least some firewalls and some border security there. Again, we already figured that out because of the acame.net being the ones answering up for their domain name, so we know that they're pretty secure. Now we'll move on to the service scan. And here in the service scan, you'll see that FTP timed out, SMTP timed out, web browsing port 80 is open, POP servers, IMAP server, and HTTPS all have timed out. And this is pretty typical when you're using a large company like AVG. So let's do another domain dossier. This time we're going to use a small business. From domain dossier, I'm going to go to titancipher.com. And I'm going to use service scan and traceroute, and then hit go. Now titancipher.com is a domain that I own. It's hosted on a small server. It's used on a WordPress platform, which is actually hosted by Bluehost. And as we go through, you're going to see that. It's going to look a lot different than the AVG answers we got last time. So in this case, we have a single IP address, which is answering up for TitanCipher. If we go into the domain records, you'll see that it's bluehost.com. That tells me who they're using. And the fact that they're using Bluehost tells you they're probably using WordPress as their platform, because Bluehost is known for that. So if you can find vulnerabilities in WordPress, you can then use those against that particular domain. Next, we're going to scroll down and you'll see more information about the actual person who owns it, their name, their address, their phone numbers, and their email addresses. All information that could be useful, again, for a spear phishing campaign or something of that nature. Network who is. So network who is, again, that's going to show us who owns the IP addresses. In this case, it's actually owned by Unified Layer Networks. They own a large block, then they've given part of that block to Bluehost, who then gave a single IP to titancipher.com. So if you notice here, they have a Class A address. So with a /16, they're going to have over 64,000 IPs. You don't want to just go in there blindly and scan 64,000 IPs if you're targeting one titancipher.com. It wouldn't make any sense. So this is going to help you identify who owns the network and what parts of the network there are. We're going to scroll down a little further. And we're going to find the DNS records. Now the DNS records here are going to show us that there's a name server answering up, bluehost.com. TitanCipher is being answered up by Bluehost, who is their provider. They do have a mail server, mail.titancipher.com. They do have a name server, second name server on Bluehost. We also see their A records, which is their IP address. Next, we can look at the traceroute. This traceroute you see looks a lot different than the traceroute we saw with AVG. In this case, everybody is answered up. We get both the IP addresses and the fully qualified domain names. So we know every single piece between CentralOps and that particular server that's answering up. Now notice the last server that answers up, that .193. Something quite interesting here. When it resolved, it didn't resolve to titancipher.com. Can you guess why? Well, the reason why is that this shows us that it's a shared server. It's not owned exclusively by TitanCipher. In fact, it's owned by Unified Layer, who owns Bluehost. So there may be 20, 30, 40, 50 different websites on this particular server. TitanCipher is just one of them. Now that's important to know, because if you try to hack titancipher.com, you may not be hitting titancipher.com. You may be hitting some of these other servers in there. And if you do that, you'd now be breaking the law because you were only hired for an assessment by this one company. So you have to be very careful when you start looking at where they're hosted. This is really important information when we look at the domain dossier. Next, we're going to go down to our service scan. And the service scan, you'll see that they're using FTP. That's a known vulnerability for us. And it even tells us what type of FTP, in this case, pure FTPD server. That's an important piece of information that we could use if we were going to hack this company. SMTP times out, therefore it's not answering up for SMTP. That's good to know. Don't throw any SMTP attacks. They are running a web server. They're running Nginx 1.10.2. We now know the version number and the software they're using. That's useful to find vulnerabilities. Again, all we're doing here is information gathering at this point. POP3 server does answer up, so there is something listening there. IMAP 143, another mail server. It's answering up as well. Things that we need to take note of. If we get into their secure site, we see port 443, secure HTTP server. So with secure HTTPS, we can see their SSL certificate here. They're using a SHA-256 RSA token as their server validation. That is information that can be useful. Bluehost.com is the ones who gave them that information, so we might be able to use that as part of a spear phishing campaign again. You can see the fact that we have Apache running as the server. You see that there at the bottom, HTTP 1.1 200 OK, server Apache. Again, more information that we want to take note of. They also have a PHP session ID. That's something else that we could take note of. We see jasondn.com/WP. WP usually stands for WordPress, so that could be vulnerabilities we could take care of. So these are all different things that we can look at as we move forward in our exploitation later on. The next thing we're going to look at is our email dossier, and we'll just click on that. And then we're going to give an email address that we want to test out. If we had email.test@hotmail.com, for instance, let's see if that's a valid email address. Click go. We find out that it is a bad email address because it was rejected by the server. Now instead, if I use an email address that I think is valid, for instance, titancipher@gmail.com, hit go. We'll see that this passed the validation test. As we scroll down, we'll see that it actually found the MX records for Google for that particular address. And when it tried to make a connection over SMTP to Google to say, does this email address exist, we can see that it did come back and say that it was successful right here, showing us that that was a good, valid email address. Let's try another one. What if we had one like titancipher23@gmail.com. Let's see if that's a valid email address. We hit go. Bad address, does not exist. So if we tried to start sending spear phishing emails towards titancipher23@gmail.com, they would just get rejected. But titancipher@gmail.com does exist and it would be a valid address to use. Where this becomes helpful is when we start looking up information on the company. For instance, if we go back to AVG, if we think their naming scheme was first name dot last name, and we found a name of someone who we think is an employee, John Smith, we can try in here john.smith@avg.com and see if it comes back as a valid or invalid address. This will help us know what is good addresses and what are bad addresses. If you start sending a lot of emails to a server with bad email addresses, that server will start realizing that it is spam coming from your address and they'll block you down. You always want to be targeted in your approach. You don't want to just shotgun things. You want to be precise like a sniper. This was just one of the tools that you can use during a reconnaissance phase. There's literally hundreds of different tools available out there, but this is just one that I particularly happen to like. I recommend that you try out various tools to figure out which one works for you and your style. Now during the rest of our course, we'll be skipping over the reconnaissance phase. This is because our virtual lab we built is separated from the internet, and therefore there simply won't be any openly available information available for us to find. This lesson was to show you the process that an attacker goes through in collecting some of the basic information they need in order to develop their attacks. Now that the reconnaissance is complete, we're going to move on to phase 2, the scanning and enumeration phase.